Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And it's one of those days where I can be really excited and extra delighted because I have Marcos Patchett with me. Hello, Marcos.
Hi Anna, hello, nice to be back. Thank you.
It's so I have had the utter delight of doing a medical astrology course with you, two parts. And the outcome of that, apart from the fact that it's inspired me in lots of different directions, is it's made me think about the whole notion of temperament. And I guess maybe the first question I want to ask you about is the way in which temperament in a natal chart is calculated, because I seem to have come across different methods of doing this.
Yeah.
So, why are there different methods?
Well, I guess because there were different methods traditionally, and they're kind of cumbersome. So I think there are different methods because there were different methods historically, and because astrologers are always trying to find shortcuts. So or ways of doing it differently. So um, I tend to, as you know now, use two main methods of calculating temperament from a birth chart. Um, and the one that I use is described by John Frawley, Contemporary Astrology, in one of his books. And it really is a sort of his distillation of some traditional methods. It's very similar to the method that William Lilly used, famous sort of 16th, 17th century English astrologer. So it's very much a sort of traditional method that he sort of cooked down, but it's kind of long-winded. It's quite a longhand method. And then in recent history, in the last sort of, I think, 10 years, Dorian Greenbaum, contemporary astrologer, wrote a book called Temperament, where she did extensive research into the historical methods of calculating temperament and devised her own much more shorthand and succinct method of calculating temperament just by giving points to, as in points value, to a few places in the birth chart. And she uses that and says that works pretty well. And as you know now from doing my course, I tend to use both. I do both. So completely ruin Dorian's aspiration to like make the whole process faster and easier. But I do think because there's often a bit of a disparity if you do it the longhand method. It sometimes agrees with Dorian's calculation, and it sometimes doesn't. So I tend to do both, and then I'll do a tiebreaker, which is really nothing more than looking at the chart and any planet that is really shouting at you in that chart. It's really prominent, and that planet will be the tiebreaker. So if it's Saturn, it's going to be melancholy. If it's the Moon or Venus, it's going to be phlegm, and so on. So the short answer to that question is because we have a few thousand years of history, and I think there were many different methods, but the traditional methods were quite long-winded, and they would rely on really sort of looking at the season, the moon phase, the sign of the ascendant, and sort of a few key points in the chart. But as always with astrologers, it's always like herding cats. Even your traditional astrologers differed in which bits of the chart they would give more emphasis to. So you ended up with a great heterogeneity of methods, a plurality. So that's why. Yeah.
That actually brings me to the biggest question that I had, which was, why is it that certain parts of the chart are emphasized in in the attempt to determine temperament? So in Greenbaum's method, there's a lot of emphasis on the ascendant and the moon and the phase of the moon, and with that the planets ruling the ascendant and the,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
as well as the season. And I'm thinking, yeah, but why are Venus, the Sun, Mars, and Mercury not factored into this?
I think that's a good question. My thinking, and this is really just my thinking on it, is because temperament is sort of like internal temperature. It's based on the hot, cold, damp, dry thing. It's sort of like that. It comes from that Aristotelian physics of how hot and cold and damp and dry are you. But then it was developed by the Roman physician Galen into the humours. So this idea that if you're cold and wet, it's phlegmatic. If you're hot and dry, it's choleric. If you're cold and dry, it's melancholic. And if you're hot and moist, it's sanguine. And people are often compounds of them. Those had, I'm getting round to the answer because this is relevant. So those had bearing, as you know, on seasons. So winter, cold and moist, phlegmatic. Summer, hot and dry, choleric. And also ages and times of day and whatnot. So I think the reason they would emphasize the season is because obvious, a season strongly emphasizes a particular temperament. Likewise, they'd emphasize the phase of the moon for similar reasons. All methods do, because the moon phase, a new moon to the first quarter is like sanguine, it's growing, and then up to full, it's becoming fully hot, like choleric. And so you can see that in terms of the sort of analogy of the sort of season and the phase of the moon, why both of those are incorporated. And then they would tend to look at the ascendant and its ruler as being indicators of the temperament, because those were the main avatars of the person in the chart. So I think we were just saying beforehand, like one of the big differences between sort of traditional and modern astrology, although we're all modern astrologers, let's face it, because we're all alive today doing astrology today, so whatever, with the benefit of hindsight. But anyway, so just in terms of a traditional astrology in inverted commas, the one of the big differences between that and say 20th century astrology is that in 20th century psychological astrology, we tend to look at the whole chart as being a representative of the person, whereas in traditional astrology you would mainly look at the ascendant and its ruler and the moon as representative of the person, as the person's avatar. So I think that's why that planet and any planets aspecting it were modifiers. So you wouldn't just give weight to any old planet in the chart unless it was having a conversation with the ascendant and its ruler in that, or if it was strongly emphasized by angle. So the traditional method that sort of Frawley uses, which he distilled, John Frawley did, was the ascendant and its ruler. You look at what planets they are, what signs they're in, and what's aspecting them. You look at the season, and then you look at the phase of the moon, and then the final thing he looks at is the Lord of the Geniture, which is the strongest planet in the chart. So because that will carry the greatest weight, and that one is interesting because that suggests there's an element, I don't know of if it's volition or if it's because what the Lord of the Geniture is a planet in the chart that is optimal. It's your best planet. It's like the one that offers the greatest prospects or the sort of the biggest wins, sort of thing. So the fact that you derive temperament, which is sort of like both constitutional and personality information from that planet, tends to me to suggest that sort of in the way that water finds its own level, we find our way to the optimal expression of ourselves, sort of thing, and that becomes a factor in. But it's a fascinating study. So I'm not sure that I've exactly answered your question, but I think I've partially answered it at least, because that the weighting towards season and moon phase was because that is very contiguous with the whole hypothesis of temperament, it being a sort of expression of like, in a sense, we're all avatars of the time when we were born. We are all stamped with that time, the time and place. That's the whole hypothesis of astrology, isn't it? That we bear that stamp. We're like living magical talismans representative of the exact moment of our birth. So that would include the season and the phase of the moon and any planetary energies, although I don't believe they are energies. I think that's all hypothetical. But anyway, whatever. We're any, from the medieval perspective, any planetary energies that were, any planetary rays that were being emphasized at that time. So I think that's where it's coming from. Does that make sense?
it does make, and what I'm kind of formulating an interpretation here, which it runs along the lines of, so your temperament maybe is your basic self, and then the interaction of other planets with whatever it is that you're, whichever method you're using, act
Mm.
as modifiers that are going to maybe pull you out, or
I'm not sure. I know where you're going with this, Anna, but I think I have to make a distinction here. In the traditional text, they made a distinction between temperament and manner. So the manner of the native is how they act, how they present, but the temperament is more fundamental. So it's more like, so a choleric person is always going to be a bit competitive and a bit driven and a bit go go go, and a phlegmatic person is always going to be a bit more laissez-faire, a bit more sensitive, a bit more,
actually
you know. Yeah.
that's what I was wanting to say. Manner is good. That's what
Okay,
I.
so that, yeah, there were distinct ways of looking at those things. So if you look at the old books like Lily's Christian Astrology Volume 3, which is on natal charts, on nativities, he has a section, the first bit of the doing the birth chart after calculating the length of life, which is a whole other interesting can of worms. But like after doing that, he would look at temperament and then look at the manner, or and then the wit and understanding of the native. So the manner was like, well, how, what are their mannerisms, how do they interact with others? So you could have a choleric person who will be ambitious and competitive and, like driven and all that, who nevertheless has quite a polished manner. They might be like a very slick debater who's always very polite and proper. They're still choleric, they're still wanting the win, but they've got a good manner. Or you could have a choleric person with a very rough manner, like a street brawling type, or getting into fights sort of thing. So those things, and really this is sort of like getting into one of the fundamental astrological debates, which is how far can we go with astrology alone in predicting behavior. And that's always an interesting one, because I think we can establish temperament, and there are certain things we can say from the chart about manner that are true, but in the tradition sometimes they would go as far as to say, and this is why this person was a murderer, or this is why this person, and I'm like, I'm not sure. It's easy to see these things in hindsight, with the benefit of 2020. Of course this person's a murderer, of course this person's a charity, philanthropist type. But actually, I think if you took 1,000 charts, it would be quite difficult to do that. You could, but I think it would be relatively simple to calculate the temperament in each case. And people who knew them would say, "Oh yeah, this person they were a bit more, they needed a bit more me time. They're a bit more sensitive. They spent lots of time not doing anything because they're like more phlegmatic, or maybe they're more melancholic, and they really thought about stuff and they remembered stuff from years ago and they spent a lot of time thinking." So that, I think, this is temperament, I think, is fundamental for that reason, because it literally is fundamental. It's something that you can, I think, reliably establish from a birth chart without adding too much predictive weight on it, which becomes a bit like, after a certain point, like playing Jenga. You're sort of saying, oh, but I'm predicting to this level of specificity, and as you know, without context, I think that's a very dangerous game. Because anyway, yeah.
No, that's actually exactly what I was thinking, was this is the baseline, and then the others are like add-ons. That's what I was thinking, the
Yeah.
modifiers,
Yes.
add-on.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I think
And
that's sort of how I think of it, I guess.
and then you use the word manner, and I thought that's exactly what I meant. It's the
Okay.
style in which you express that temperament, if I can put it like that. So
Yes.
that's very interesting. And I haven't I think I'm about halfway through William Lilly's second volume. So
Okay. Yeah, yeah, it's big. They're big. There's a lot.
because the interesting thing I think that you said is that then there's a whole other section about manner and wit and reason, because that's like the rounded personality. And that's exactly what I was thinking. There's something missing here.
Yeah, no, temperament is the undercoat, it's the base coat, it's the fundamental, and then you add the manner and the wit or understanding of the native on top of that. So, like with wit and understanding, it's sort of like the Mercury moon. You're mainly focusing on the Mercury and the moon, and which one of those is dominant. Are they going to be more emotional or a bit more logical? And are there any distortions in their thinking or in their emotional processing? And so it's, and all of these are kind of a tricky value judgments. And I was thinking this today because I work through sort of these, when I'm doing birth charts, I tend to view things as potentials and liabilities. You know, you could think of them as gifts and challenges, but I like potentials and liabilities. And I work through, I create a list of all of those on either side, sort of like the plus and minus column. And then I think one of the jobs of an astrologer is to point out the potentials and the liabilities and say, maximize these and watch out for those. You know, that's what it is. So I think, you know, you could, it's more that, and then I think I don't think of it as deterministic, in the sense that if you have this snarky manner, and certainly if sometimes if you read traditional astrology texts and you go back to your chart, you might think, oh my God, I'm the worst person in the world, because it'll describe this bad aspect between two planets as like, this person is just horrible and slanderous, and you're just like, oh no. But actually all of these things, when you start inventorying them and adding up, you'll see that almost any chart has quite the list of potentials and liabilities. And yeah, sure, some lean more towards the plus or the minus column, but even, you know, what, because most astrologers in the traditional camp will spot obvious pluses, like planets in essential dignity, or, you know, planets that are, say, in mutual reception or something. And most 20th century psychological astrologers will focus on things like trines and sextiles. But beyond that, you've got a whole list of other factors that you itemize, and when you start getting into the weeds, everything starts getting nuanced, which is where it gets interesting.
Exactly. And I think this is the important thing is, as you said, you know, we need the nuance, which is what I felt was missing. And it was one of the reasons why I thought it'd be interesting to have this conversation, is because I felt there was something missing. And
yes,
there was. um, but I think you're right. In the traditional texts, the language is, let's just say they don't hold back on their thoughts. It's usually quite.
Yeah, they don't. And also I think this is an important point, Anna, for I've made it before, but I think it's important, which is that the language of the traditional texts is almost the opposite writing convention from 20th century and contemporary texts, you know, where they will give the maximum possible example of any one aspect or thing. So when you have traditional cookbooks like Firmicus, he'll say, so like Venus conjunct, Venus on an angle at night or something. This person will be awarded prizes of wreaths and celebrated for their beauty and all this good stuff and whatever. But then, like, you know, Saturn on an angle at night, this person will die childless and alone, and just, you know what I mean? It's like he'll give the like maximum example. Now, but the thing is, at the end of the chapters, you would always say, you know, always balance this with your knowledge and of other things. I'm paraphrasing, but the examples were given in a very memorable extreme version, so the astrologer will get a very clear idea of whether this factor in isolation was a good thing or a bad thing. But then it was always expected that the astrologer would add this together with everything else and modify and then come synthesize it. So whereas modern textbooks do the opposite, we're very careful not to terrify readers and not to, you know, give them a heart attack reading it. So we do the opposite, where we sort of go, oh, you know, this Venus Saturn aspect, it can be a bit difficult and there could be some difficulties, but basically it's all right, and it probably just means that you're good working with old clothes or something. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's sort of like, you know, there's one extreme to the other, and I think I think there's virtue in both of those approaches, but the truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the middle. And actually, the bottom line is you always have to not take that one bit of the chart apart and then recontextualize it.
Coming into this from a psychological astrologer's point of view, what I find really tremendously exciting is to see that psychology has always been a part of astrology.
Yeah, it
That's
has. Yeah.
that's the thing, and I've always known that. I just hadn't had, I guess, the inclination to delve too deeply. Or I no, I've had the inclination. I just hadn't had the opportunity yet because things happen when the time is right. And so this year, as or you inspired me, and I've
Oh,
thought, okay, well, this is the time because I have the opportunity here, so I'm grabbing it. I find it absolutely fascinating. I've always, I mean, part of my degree was in medieval French and English literature, so you can see I'm
okay.
home with William, you know, obviously going to be the case. So, but the point here is I'm looking at psychology as it was being practiced in the time, and
Yes.
and when you strip away, as you say, the florid language, which I get, is it's to create the impression. And you know, when we're teaching, we use analogies. We use
Yeah.
analogies. We're not going to use that type of analogy, but what are we doing when we're using myths to illustrate, or when we're using modern um, TV programs or whatever to illustrate? We're doing exactly that. So
Yeah.
very,
No, I
very
agree.
important.
The morality play element has always been there in human storytelling in various ways. But obviously, in medieval and ancient sources, the societies were a lot more explicitly religious, and there was a lot more explicit sort of moral, be careful of your behavior, kind of like finger wagging thing. So, or a sense in which things were predestined, which can feel quite heavy to the modern reader. But when you read between the lines, when you actually start looking at the astrology itself, I think there is a lot more nuance, and certainly in practice, when you start breaking it down, you start seeing that that it becomes, things become a lot less black and white.
And in fact, I would say that and this is not, how can I put this? This is this is what we are evolving even in our time, because that judgment element is still very strong. We can see, you know, all around the essence of that judgment
Yeah.
going round and being divisive. But if I'm looking at the movement in terms of how we deal with dogs, for instance, it is indicative very strongly of a change in the way that we are, well, attempting to understand behavior, I think is what I'm getting at, because we're much more reluctant to say this is bad behavior, and much more likely to say, why is that happening?
That's
What are
good.
the
Yeah.
stress behind? And so there's, you know, in the dog behavior world, or the dog training world, there is a split between those who are still very much all about disciplining the dog, but thankfully much more in the minority. Then there are those who are saying, well, let's have a balanced approach. We punish and reward. And there are those that are saying, let's just encourage the behavior through reward.
Mm,
And that has been very successful in the last
yeah.
decade, so last 20 years. But now we're moving in a completely different direction, where we're going, okay, could we just stop saying that and ask the dog what the dog needs and what it wants, and see where we can go from there by understanding? And I think that is indicative of a society that is moving towards understanding as being the main aim when we're looking at psychology. And so when we're as psychological astrologers or traditional astrologers slash psychological astrologers, what we're trying to do is understand why it might be that this Moon Saturn square is actually, the person is coming across as cold and,
Yeah.
you know, rest. And I think that's obviously been the case, for some time in astrology and psychology both. But I think I find that very encouraging.
Yeah, I think it is. It's an interesting one. I have several tangential thoughts from that. I mean, just to bring it back to temperament a little bit. I mean, I think because obviously from a medical point of view, that this all has medical, so more basic medical utility as well. So I think that's the other sort of function of temperament traditionally, was to sort of on a really simple level, if you can work out somebody's temperament, you can say something about their behavioral inclinations, but you can also say something about how you could fortify them, or what that person might need to feel stronger. So there's always been that sense of adapting, using astrology to help adapt to that person. But it's interesting that, just from what you were saying now about the sort of like the increasing movement towards, and this is another tangent I had from what you were speaking about, judgment is such an interesting word, because as astrologers, what we strive to do is to judge the chart. That's what we are doing. We are judging, but there's different levels on which the word judgment can be applied, So judgment sometimes has an overtone of being punitive, or of being when you apply judgment to something, you're necessarily sort of weighing it up and saying, is this good or bad? And that can feel like a person is being judged in a negative sense. So I think it's that which we've got to be careful of as astrologers, because what we should be aiming to do is to, I mean, I hate this language because it's so fluffy, but it's like encouraging people to be their best selves, like it's sort of like, but that's really literally what we're trying to do. It's sort of, yeah. But an element of judgment has to be involved in that, in the sense that you have to be able to point. Do you know what I mean? It's but I think we're talking about two different levels of thing
Exactly.
there.
It's not judgment as in a value, it's judgment as in reason, being able to judge something, judge the way something's going to go, estimate the way something's going to go. It's that sense.
Yeah.
So it's more about reasoning rather than placing a value on.
Yeah.
But it's, I think the thing I love about working with temperament is that when you understand it, it helps you to think about how to help, how to. It's a very interesting thing, because inherent within that understanding, there is. I don't want to use the word remedy, because it's not like I'm, wanting a medicine. It's a support. It's how to support.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm a herbalist, so I love the word remedy. So I'd totally go for remedy. But No, I understand that not everything has to be pathologized. You don't have to be ill. It's about rebalancing. Really, was that would be sort of like more in line with the traditional thinking. So if somebody's very phlegmatic, for example, you might want to warm, heat, and dry them a little bit. You might want to recognize that because they're phlegmatic, you don't want to exhaust them. You don't want to overstimulate them, because they won't have it. But a little bit of gentle exercise, some slightly spicier food, and really basic things like that. Bit more exercise, a little bit of spicy food, get you moving a little bit, doing stuff but because they're phlegmatic and there's an emotional sensitive, maybe those exercises would be involving people they were close to, or sort of like more in. So not Zumba class, more like walking the dog. Do you know what I mean? So it's got
Yeah.
that element of, so it's so basic but so helpful, because if you know the temperament, you can actually give straight away some really, really simple, you have some immediate keys into how that person might, on a really baseline foundational level, improve or maintain their physical and mental health. So I think
And
that's
that's
really important.
what I love about it, because it is this acknowledgement of who the person is and what they need and how we can gently help them. And it's I would encourage those of you who have not delved into this world of temperament to find out more about it. And I think you'll be surprised. I certainly was to discover, that I am predominantly melancholic,
Aha.
and because I'm generally cheerful and optimistic.
I would have thought you're a melancholic sanguine, though, right? You've definitely.
Thought so. But you know what? The more I think about it, the more I realize, yep, there's sanguine there, but
Well, you
predominantly
can you can go either way. So, like my sister, for example, is sanguine melancholic. She's dominant sanguine with a second melancholic streak. She's sort of got everything in Gemini on the midheaven, and then but Virgo rising, I think, like yourself. And so there's a streak of melancholy that's sort of secondary, and that shows up as very light-hearted, funny, but then with a sort of slightly pessimistic and analytical streak in there. And maybe you're the slight flip of that, with a lot of sort of a bit more pessimism and analysis, but with a little liking a little joke. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
it's
it's but it's what you were saying about the temperament being like the foundation. And
mm,
I realized that my foundation absolutely truly is melancholic, right down to the
okay.
fact that um to keep me warm is hard.
Yeah, you're colder. You're physically colder.
Physically, physically struggle with staying warm.
And is
And
autumn your most difficult season? I mean, because
it
for melon.
used to be. It
Okay.
used Now, interestingly, I used to start getting depressed at the end of summer because I was
Mm,
anticipating the coming of autumn.
okay.
And now one of my favorites, it's actually autumn and spring are my favorite seasons. I
That's
love,
interesting. That's interesting.
and I've grown to love winter almost more than summer. Almost.
That's very interesting because
And so I realized, no, actually, do you know what? I wanted to reject this, that, because not I'm not a pessimist. Usually I'm
no,
very, resolution based, and all of that, very active. But the baseline, I know, right down to my struggle with temperature or lack of temperature.
well,
So
that's interesting because I would have pegged you as sanguine melancholic, but I melancholic sanguine would also make sense. I mean that would be where but as we've talked about today, like the manner can be slightly different. So you could have somebody who's and I've had this. I've had clients who are, I look at their chart and they're just melancholic all the way through, but they have, because their ruling planet is in an air sign conjunct Venus, they have this very light way of expressing themselves. And then as you get to know them, you realize, oh my God, they're worried about everything. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, so, and they're analyzing stuff from 20 years ago and just like, really going deep on everything. So there is that difference between manner and temperament sometimes. So yeah, it's fascinating, but temperament, because it's got that physical component, as you say, that really shows up too.
that's
So,
what it for me.
mm,
It was the physical side, and I realized, yeah, actually, right down to the fact that my nails can split. You know,
okay. I mean, just generally, melancholic would be a bit colder, a bit more, as they'd say. You don't have to answer this one, Anna. They'd say traditionally it was a bit more costive, like retaining, not going to the loo as easily. Don't answer that. They'd also be a bit more dry, generally tendency to dryness. And they'd say if you're really strong melancholy, sometimes fearful dreams, a bit more sort of like a darker dreams sometimes. What else? There are a few other things, sort of ruminating on things a lot. deep thinkers, deep cogitators, because melancholy was the humor of retention. So enable you to hold on to things good and bad. You know, you'd retain facts, but also remember the time that that neighbor 20 years ago called you a bad name and you'll never forget it. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of like it's got all the retention. So yeah, and so there are those things just generically hold true, if there's a predominance of melancholy, and it will wax and wane. So in middle age being the age of melancholy, that's when, if you have any melancholy in your temperament, that's when melancholy would maximize, which is why I said, oh, it's interesting that now, because we're similar age, it would be like now you're kind of like loving autumn most. That's really weird almost, because it's like your maximum melancholy season. It should be like you're almost like, oh, get away from me, autumn. But actually, no, you've gone the other way. You're like you're adapted to it more.
Tell you why though, because it's interesting because it's the warmth of autumn that
Hmm.
I'm onto. It's the colors. So it's so the reason
Oh,
so uh, it's not because I want to talk about myself. I'm just wanting to
no, 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 no. This is a good. It's a good illustration, actually.
illustrate
Yeah.
exactly the point that you made, that it is like a foundation. And so it it's the craving of warmth that
Mhm.
is predominant with me, is this craving of warmth. And I am never happier than when I'm in the sea either. So it's the craving of warmth and fluid. So autumn, so autumn for me does not represent any longer the cold. Okay, I get cold. That's fine. It takes a while for me to warm up. That's fine. I just have to wear extra layers and go for a long walk.
Yeah.
But because of that, it's such a warm season, because it's the season of fires, and it's the season of the leaves on the trees, and hot water bottles and hot chocolates, and I that's the kind of thing that I don't do in summer,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
I will do in autumn and winter, and the candlelight, and it's all that softness. So it, rather than bringing out the melancholy as it would have done once upon a time,
It brings
actually
that. That's interesting. I mean, I
everything.
do think Libra, particularly that Libra season when everything goes, the leaves all turn. It's pretty. It's pretty. Libra season is pretty, and it's like that end of September, just before, like the end of Virgo, just before Libra. That is the second spring. That's when you get like fresh nettle growths coming up, and because the plant, because it's literally the length. As you now know, we talked about Anticia or that, the length of day and night is the same as in Aries. When Virgo length of day and night, same as when the sun's in Aries. So literally we have a little second spring, and then we enter the Libra phase. And that Libra phase, that seems the perfect season for me. It matches, if your natal temperament, and I'm making an assumption here, is actually melancholic sanguine. Libra is the perfect, because we're not in the middle of the melancholic season, which would be Scorpio season, where we've just been. It would be like just entering autumn, which would be melancholy increasing, but you've still got a bit of that. There's a little bit of sanguine there because it's an air sign or something. So I don't know. There's something about it that seems to match, but I don't know. I might just be making that up, but I think it
Yeah,
sounds right.
it sounds about right. It does. And I certainly don't enjoy the Scorpio season because I am indeed a Taurus. So it's
Well, it's fun. I'm an Aries, but I actually quite like Libra. I quite like my North Node is in Libra, so that's probably
yeah.
why. But yeah, yeah.
Marcos, if you want to learn more about your wonderful work as a herbalist and medical astrologer, how do they do that?
Oh, thank you, Anna. Well, there are a couple of ways. You can check out my little YouTube channel on here, which is the Nocturnal Herbalist. You could have a look at. I'm doing a couple of courses at Kepler College on decumbiture and medical astrology. And Lee Lehman there is building a fantastic medical astrology, what eventually will be a whole diploma, I think. So keep an eye on that. And then there's also for just personal, for my work as a herbalist or as an astrologer, there's nocturnalherbalist.com, which is my website.
And I know that on your YouTube channel, you've been doing some lovely videos.
Oh,
Um,
thanks.
and you've been putting a lot of work into that. So please do go and check that out, and along with your
Thank you.
website. If you want to learn more, now I've done the course and it's brilliant. I love it.
Oh, thank
So,
you. Oh, that
um,
makes me happy that you enjoyed it, Anna, and you got good stuff out of it. So
well, I'll tell you something. I don't yet know. Up until about a week ago, I wasn't sure how I was going to apply it to my work, how it was going to feed into my work, and all of a sudden, I'm full of ideas. So
okay,
clearly, it's like it's beginning to
it's
seep.
fermenting. It's like
Yeah,
that's good.
so,
This is good.
so wonderful, and thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me back, Anna, and thank you. Nice speaking to you as usual.
Thank you all for watching. Next time, we're going to be looking at astrology, tarot, and runes. Until then, goodbye.